You stand in the shadow of a marble pilaster, your breath shallow, your heart drumming against your ribs. The year is 1501, and the October air inside these Vatican chambers carries the scent of burning wax, roasted chestnuts, and something darker anticipation thick enough to taste, through the flickering light cast by dozens of candelabras. You watch as silk garments begin to pool on the floor like liquid sin. This is the papal palace, the earthly seat of Christ's vicar, and you are about to witness an evening so depraved that scribes will bury the account in sealed archives for 4 centuries, hoping future generations might never learn what transpired when the most powerful spiritual leader on earth decided holiness was negotiable. Before we descend into this forgotten chapter of Vatican history, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? It's genuinely remarkable that we can explore these hidden corners of the past together, connected across continents by our shared fascination with the truths that history tried to bury. If you're intrigued by these untold stories, consider hitting that subscribe button, and the like. It helps us continue uncovering the scandals, rituals, and forbidden moments that shaped our world. The man presiding over tonight's spectacle wore the triple crown of the papacy, but his path to that throne was paved with gold coins rather than prayers. What you're about to hear isn't Protestant propaganda or the fevered imagination of the Church's enemies. It comes from the meticulous Latin diary of Johannes Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, a man whose professional obligation to record Vatican protocol placed him in the rooms where saints should have walked but demons danced instead. His account, preserved in the Vatican secret archives and sealed for centuries, describes an event so explicit that even 19th-century historians who finally gained access questioned whether such depravity could have occurred within consecrated walls. It did, and the chestnuts scattered across that marble floor would become symbols of how far divine authority can fall when wielded by hands that have forgotten the meaning of sacred. Rodrigo de Borja was born on New Year's Day, 1431, in Jativa, a sun-scorched Spanish town near Valencia, where the dust of ordinary streets clung to his childhood clothes. Nothing in that provincial beginning suggested the trajectory that would carry him to the throne of St. Peter, but destiny wore the face of his uncle Alfonso de Borja, who became Pope Calixtus III in 1455. Nepotism flowed through the Church's veins like sacramental wine in those days, and when Alfonso ascended, young Rodrigo's fate was sealed with the wax of a papal bull. At 25, he became a cardinal deacon not through spiritual devotion or theological brilliance, but through the oldest currency in Rome, family connection. He arrived in the Eternal City with hunger burning behind his eyes, and Rome, that magnificent theater of contradictions, welcomed him with open arms and closed purses, ready to be opened for the right price. The Rome of the late 15th century existed in permanent cognitive dissonance. By daylight, pilgrims knelt before gilded altars, their prayers rising like incense toward painted heavens. By nightfall, those same streets witnessed transactions that would have made ancient Roman brothel keepers blush. The papal court had become a marketplace where everything benefices, absolutions, cardinals' hats, salvation itself carried a price tag denominated in gold ducats. Rodrigo Borgia understood this economy better than most. He accumulated ecclesiastical positions across Europe with the methodical precision of a merchant acquiring properties, treating sacred offices as revenue streams rather than spiritual responsibilities. His lifestyle resembled a Renaissance prince more than a man of God. Lavish banquets in palaces decorated by the finest artists, mistresses who moved through his chambers with the regularity of the seasons, and children legitimate in his eyes if not in canon law, who became chess pieces in his grand strategy for power. The most significant of these relationships was with Vanozza de Catane, a Roman noblewoman whose beauty was matched only by her political acumen. Between 1474 and 1482, she bore Rodrigo 4 children who would become central players in the drama about to unfold: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre. Each represented a potential alliance, a marriage pawn, a tool to be deployed in the great game their father played with kingdoms as prizes. Even as a cardinal, Rodrigo's conduct scandalized a city already accustomed to clerical vice. In 1460, Pope Pius II wrote him a scathing letter condemning behavior in Siena that had shocked the whole town. But shame was a luxury Rodrigo could not afford. He had a papacy to win, and moral reservations were obstacles to overcome rather than principles to honor. The conclave of August 1492 unfolded like a carefully choreographed ballet of corruption. 23 cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel, beneath walls not yet adorned with Michelangelo's judgment, but already witness to plenty of earthly sin. Gold changed hands with the fluidity of holy water. Promises were whispered in shadowed corners like confessions without penance. When white smoke finally rose on August 11th, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI. His victory achieved through what contemporaries openly acknowledged as simony the buying and selling of holy office. Remarkably, the Romans celebrated. They had grown fond of their Spanish cardinal and anticipated a pontificate of magnificence and energy. Bonfires illuminated the 7 hills, torchlit processions wound through ancient streets, and triumphal arches rose like prayers made manifest. The coronation at St. Peter's Basilica on August 26th drew what observers called the greatest ovation any pontiff had ever received. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed divine providence had placed the right man on the throne of St. Peter. They could not yet see the shadows gathering behind his smile. Alexander VI began his reign with measures that promised genuine reform. Rome's streets, plagued by over 200 murders in the months before his election, were divided into districts with magistrates empowered to maintain order. The new pope personally heard grievances every Tuesday, dispensing justice with what contemporaries praised as admirable efficiency. But power, like strong wine, reveals character rather than creating it. Alexander's initial reforms were soon overshadowed by his relentless pursuit of advancement for his children. Juan was made Duke of Gandia and married to a cousin of the Spanish king. Cesare, despite being only 18, was appointed Archbishop of Valencia, and later elevated to cardinal positions he treated as stepping stones rather than sacred callings. The papal apartments became a theater where sacred and profane performed an obscene ballet. Alexander's mistress, Julia Farnese, known throughout Rome as Julia la Bella for her extraordinary beauty, moved through Vatican corridors as freely as any cardinal. Her presence was a constant reminder that the Pope's spiritual vows had been trampled underfoot by earthly desires. Contemporary observers noted that she seemed to wield influence over papal decisions, her whispers carrying more weight than the carefully reasoned arguments of theologians. The scandal was compounded by the fact that she was married to another man, making the Pope not merely unchaste but complicit in ongoing adultery that mocked the sacrament the Church claimed to safeguard. Into this world of gilded corruption stepped Johannes Burchard, a man whose temperament and position would make him the most dangerous witness in Vatican history. Born around 1450 in Niederhaslach, Alsace, this methodical German priest had studied canon law and risen through ecclesiastical ranks to become papal master of ceremonies, a position that granted him intimate access to the most private moments of papal life. Beginning in 1483 under Pope Sixtus IV, Burchard maintained what he called his Liber Notarum, a detailed diary recording both the magnificent ceremonies and the scandalous conduct of 5 different popes. Burchard possessed the soul of an accountant and the eye of a court stenographer. His writings lack romantic flourishes or moral editorializing, but they carry the crushing weight of truth precisely because of their dry, matter-of-fact tone. He recorded papal coronations with the same meticulous attention he devoted to papal orgies, creating a documentary record that would eventually make even hardened Vatican archivists uncomfortable centuries later. The master of ceremonies occupied a unique position within the papal hierarchy, neither high enough to participate in the corruption, nor low enough to be excluded from witnessing it. Like a shadow cast by candlelight, he moved through the Vatican's most private spaces, observing everything while appearing to matter very little. Cardinals confided in him about ceremonial matters and forgot his presence during moments when discretion should have prevailed. This professional invisibility became his greatest asset as a chronicler of papal vice. He watched, he recorded, and he preserved details that would have been buried forever had less meticulous hands held the quill. By the late 1490s, the Borgia family's behavior had begun attracting negative attention throughout Europe. Alexander's eldest son, Juan, had become Duke of Gandia, but his character proved as corrupt as his elevation was undeserved. Stories circulated about Juan's cruelty, his sexual excesses, his incompetence as a military commander. Then came June 14, 1497, which changed everything. Juan's body was discovered floating in the Tiber River, his throat cut and his corpse bearing 9 wounds. The murder sent shockwaves through Rome and struck Alexander with grief so profound that observers wondered if divine justice had finally visited the Borgia family. For 3 days and nights, the Pope refused food and sleep, weeping behind closed doors. In his anguish, Alexander announced a program of church reform measures to restrain the luxury of the papal court, reorganize the apostolic chancery, suppress simony and concubinage. But grief, like everything else in Alexander's character, proved temporary. Within months, the reform proposals were forgotten. The Pope's attention turned to his surviving children, particularly Cesare, whose iron will and ruthless ambition would now drive the family's agenda. Cesare possessed a magnetism that drew admirers and enemies with equal force. Tall, handsome, possessed of intelligence bordering on genius, he had initially been destined for the church. But Cesare's talents lay in warfare and statecraft. In 1498, he resigned his cardinalate, the first cardinal in history to voluntarily abandon the sacred office and set his sights on secular power. Through a combination of siege warfare, assassination, and political manipulation, Cesare carved out a domain in central Italy that made him one of the most powerful men in Europe. His methods were so effective that Niccolò Machiavelli would later use him as the model for the Prince, admiring Cesare's ability to combine cruelty with efficiency. The sale of indulgences, church offices, and cardinals' hats became systematic during Alexander's later years. Wealthy families could purchase ecclesiastical positions for their sons, effectively buying salvation along with social status. The College of Cardinals expanded not through spiritual merit, but through financial contribution, as Alexander appointed 47 new cardinals during his reign, each appointment representing thousands of ducats flowing into the papal treasury and ultimately into Cesare's war chest. The Vatican apartments during these years became a stage for increasingly elaborate entertainments that tested the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Alexander delighted in theatrical performances, musical concerts, and dinner parties extending deep into the night. Guests included cardinals, ambassadors, wealthy merchants, and an assortment of courtesans. These gatherings served multiple purposes: demonstrations of papal wealth and power, opportunities for political negotiation, and testing grounds for loyalty. Cardinals who participated were implicated in the Pope's behavior, making them reluctant to criticize him. The atmosphere grew increasingly permissive, the boundaries of propriety pushed further with each passing month. The autumn of 1501 found the Borgia family at the height of their power and perhaps their corruption. Cesare had successfully completed his conquest of Romagna, earning praise from military observers throughout Europe. The Jubilee year of 1500 had brought hundreds of thousands of pilgrims to Rome, filling both the papal treasury and the city's brothels. It was in this atmosphere of triumph and moral decay that Cesare Borgia conceived what would become known as the Banquet of Chestnuts, an event so scandalous that its very name would become synonymous with papal depravity for centuries. The date was October 31st, 1501. All Hallows' Eve, when the boundary between sacred and profane was traditionally acknowledged to be at its thinnest. On a night dedicated to remembering the dead, the Borgia family was about to commit acts that would kill whatever remained of papal dignity. Cesare's apartments in the Vatican occupied part of the papal palace magnificently decorated by Pinturicchio during the early years of Alexander's reign. Frescoed walls depicted scenes from classical mythology and Christian history, creating an ironic backdrop for events that belonged to neither tradition. They could not look away from what was about to unfold, though centuries of church historians would wish they could. The guest list revealed the breadth of corruption the Borgias had achieved. Cardinals who should have been spending the evening in prayer mixed with Roman nobles whose wealth had purchased their silence about previous papal scandals. Diplomats from various European courts attended, perhaps viewing the evening as an opportunity to gather intelligence, or perhaps simply drawn by curiosity. But the true stars of the evening were the 50 courtesans Cesare had assembled. These were not common prostitutes, but sophisticated women who understood the delicate art of providing pleasure while maintaining the discretion powerful men required. They arrived dressed in their finest silks, adorned with jewels that caught the candlelight, their faces painted with cosmetics imported from Venice. They understood their role in the evening's theater and prepared to perform it with the professionalism that had made them successful. Johannes Burchard, in his capacity as master of ceremonies, was present that evening not as a participant, but as an observer. His official duties required him to be available for any ceremonial functions that might arise, even during private entertainments. This professional obligation placed him in the perfect position to witness and record events that other observers might have preferred to forget. They could not look away, and neither could Burchard, his quill moving steadily across parchment as history's most scandalous papal evening unfolded. According to Burchard's meticulous record, the evening began conventionally enough with dinner served in Cesare's private chambers. The meal featured delicacies appropriate to the season, accompanied by wines from the papal cellars carefully aged in Roman caves. Conversation flowed smoothly, touching on politics, military campaigns, and artistic patronage. Servants moved silently between the tables, maintaining the illusion that this was merely another elegant dinner party. But as the final course was cleared away, the atmosphere began its inexorable shift from civilized to savage. In 1501, within the Vatican's candlelit chambers, Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, presided over what became one of history's most scandalous nights, the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts. The event, recorded by Johannes Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, exposed the depths of corruption inside the Renaissance Church. Rodrigo Borgia, born in 1431 in Spain, rose to power through his uncle, Pope Calixtus III. He mastered Rome's corrupt system, buying offices and influence until he secured the papacy in 1492 through blatant simony. As Pope Alexander VI, he turned the church into a family enterprise, elevating his children Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre into positions of power and marrying them into noble alliances. His court became infamous for excess, his mistresses public, and his corruption boundless. Johannes Burchard's impartial diary preserved every act, from coronations to orgies. His record of October 31, 1501. All Hallows' Eve described Cesare Borgia hosting 50 courtesans and dozens of cardinals, nobles, and diplomats in the papal palace. As the night deepened, garments fell, music quickened, and the women danced nude under candlelight. Servants scattered chestnuts across the marble floor, and the courtesans crawled to collect them while the Pope, Cesare, and Lucrezia looked on. The contest that followed turned sacred ground into a theater of lust, men competing for prizes by sleeping with the women, their performances publicly tallied. Pope Alexander VI observed without shame. By morning, the marble floors were swept clean, but the story had already escaped the palace. Rumors raced through Europe, reinforcing every charge of papal corruption reformers had whispered. The banquet of chestnuts became the symbol of a decaying church. Alexander VI ignored the outrage, continuing his lavish life until his death in 1503, rumored to be by poison. His son Cesare soon lost power and died in battle. Lucrezia lived on, her name forever tied to scandal. When Pope Julius II succeeded him, he refused to live in the same apartments, commissioning Raphael to paint frescoes in new rooms above as if to erase the memory of sin below. Centuries later, when the Vatican archives opened, Burchard's testimony confirmed what legend had preserved. The banquet of chestnuts endures as a warning of what happens when faith becomes theater, power eclipses virtue, and the holiest seat on earth hosts its own descent into hell.